always. All you hear is oxygen.
In the midst of some encouraging signs, one doctor in Queens, New York warns this fight is far from over.
This as hospitalization rates in the Empire State flatten.
Several states are now beginning to map out strategies to restart the economy. But is America's approach to this crisis the right one? We take a closer look at two nations, Sweden barely locking down in the crisis, Germany testing aggressively. What lessons can be learned? Here at home, questions continue to swirl. What did our government know and when? The president has defended his actions. He also retweeted a remark saying it's time to fire Fauci. Is the job of the nation's leading expert on this fight at risk? And a deadly tornado outbreak that could not have happened at a worse time. The dramatic images flooding our newsroom. Hundreds of homes damaged and destroyed. More than 24 killed. And then there was this moment that absolutely melted our hearts. A 6-year-old girl reunited with her mother, a healthcare worker, after a month apart.
Love that video. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for streaming with us. I'm Lindsay Davis. New York City Mayor called today a very good day. He based that comment on the reduced number of new hospitalizations, the number of people in ICUs, and the percentage of people testing positive for coronavirus. On a personal note, my single biggest fear in all of this was that my parents would get COVID-19, and on Friday I learned that my mother does have it, and she is hanging in there. I share that only because all of us in some way are so deeply caught up in the tentacles of this thing. And I do know this much is true, that hope and joy can coexist with sorrow and pain. And in that same vein, today Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, delivered this message that while the number of deaths have flattened, he says it's at a horrific level of pain and grief and sorrow. Cuomo also offered a hopeful message, saying he believes the worst is over, but only if everyone continues to stay smart. And tonight, he and a group of governors on the East Coast have teamed up to come up with a plan to reopen the economy. Our Tom Yamas leads us off.
Tonight, nearly a month since the first person died in New York from COVID-19, Governor Andrew Cuomo confronting a horrific milestone. More than 10,000 New Yorkers now dead of coronavirus.
The terrible news is as terrible as it gets. This is 671 people who passed away on Easter Sunday.
But even during this darkness, some light. Fewer New Yorkers are being hospitalized. Fewer are being put on ventilators. And though the death toll remains staggering, now fewer people are dying.
Those numbers say we can control the spread. Feel good about that. The worst is over. Yeah, if we continue to be smart going forward.
At Mount Sinai Hospital in Queens, Dr. Eric Bluttinger has seen a change. Just 1 week ago, the hospital was besieged.
I'm about ready to walk into the ED. We'll see what the situation's like. I heard that our volume is just exploding.
Scenes like this played out in ICUs around the city.
Things are just totally crazy right now. Everyone is COVID positive in these hallways. All you hear is oxygen.
But when we spoke to Dr. Bluttinger today, he too was sounding encouraged.
Certainly, it does feel like we are slowly turning the corner.
But as New York cases plateau and major cities like Philadelphia level off, other parts of the country are seeing spikes. In Massachusetts, Governor Charlie Baker with a warning.
I want people to realize that today is the beginning of what we expect is going to be a very difficult period.
Among the hardest hit, the elderly. More than 800 people have died in Massachusetts, and nearly 45% of them in nursing homes.
My dad's in one of those facilities, so I take this stuff pretty seriously.
The virus now claiming lives in all 50 states. In Chicago, a somber procession for a firefighter. In New York City, word 21 teachers have died. And across the country, grocery store workers, now essential to all of us, paying a terrible price. Their largest union now reporting at least 30 have perished.
This is about life or death. Workers are being exposed and they are dying.
In South Dakota, one of the nation's largest pork processing plants shutting down after nearly 240 workers tested positive. But weeks into this crisis, the conversation now turning to how and when the country can reopen. The governor of Texas was blunt.
This is not going to be a rush to the gates. Everybody is able to suddenly reopen all at once.
The CDC director saying the first step is widespread testing, something that is not yet available.
We're going to need to have that aggressively employed as we begin to reopen and to basically prevent the opportunity for community transmission to come back into the system.
Governor Cuomo also preparing for his state to take the next step.
You'll start to open that valve on the economic activity. And you'll turn that valve very slowly. And while you're opening that valve, watch the meter. What's the meter? The meter is the infection rate. And if you see that infection rate start ticking up, which would be undermining everything we have accomplished thus far, then you know you've opened the valve too fast.
New York now banding together with 6 other states to develop a joint plan to reopen the East Coast. Out west, the governors of Washington, Oregon, and California forming a similar strategic alliance. But in the nation's capital, President Trump, who resisted calls to impose a national lockdown, tweeting that when it comes to reopening the country, it's the decision of the president. Cuomo making it clear the road to recovery will be long.
It's not going to be we flick a switch and everybody comes out of their house and gets in their car and waves and hugs each other and the economy all starts up. I would love to say that's going to happen. It's not going to happen that way. It can't happen that way.
And Tom Llamas joins us now from New York City. Tom, you were on that call that Cuomo had with other governors today as they discussed this difficult balancing act of just when to reopen. What was your takeaway?
You know, there was about 6 governors on that call, Lindsay. One governor calling it the COVID corridor. States like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. Essentially, the states all want to work together, but they know ultimately the decision is up to them individually when they want to reopen their states. All the governors are worried about new spikes, so they don't want to reopen too early. And they do want to work hand in hand with the president. The president just tonight said he has the ultimate authority to reopen the country. But these governors also know that they ultimately have the power in their own states. We're seeing the same story on the West Coast. The governors of Washington, Oregon, and California forming a coalition there. And tomorrow, the governor of California will release a detailed plan on when he wants to reopen the California economy. And Lindsay, we know there are so many people in that state looking forward to that. Lindsay?
Tom Llamas for us in New York City. Thanks, Tom. And let's go now to Washington, where the president raised some eyebrows today after retweeting a message saying that it's time to #fire Fauci, referring to Dr. Anthony Fauci, after the top infectious disease specialist said this weekend the administration could have potentially done more to slow the spread of the coronavirus early on. That comes as the Trump administration is ramping up efforts to examine when to reopen the economy, with a new task force expected to be announced tomorrow. ABC's Terry Moran is in Washington with the latest from the White House.
It was an ominous sign. President Trump retweeting last night an attack on Dr. Anthony Fauci. The original tweet including the #time to fire Fauci. This on the same day Fauci declared in an interview on CNN that the administration's reluctance to call for shutdowns and strong social distancing measures sooner has cost more American lives in the pandemic.
Obviously, you could logically say that if you had a process that was ongoing and you started mitigation earlier, you could have saved lives. Obviously, no one is going to deny that. But there was a lot of pushback about shutting things down back then.
And here's what Fauci said just moments ago.
I was asked a hypothetical question. And hypothetical questions sometimes can get you into some difficulty. The nature of the hypothetical question was if, in fact, we had mitigated earlier, could lives have been saved? And the answer to my question was, as I always do, and I'm doing right now, perfectly honestly, say, yes. I mean, obviously.
But Fauci went on to say that when he and Dr. Deborah Birx went to the president with their recommendations, Trump listened.
The first and only time that Dr. Birx and I went in and formally made a recommendation to the president listened to the recommendation and went to the mitigation. The next second time that I went with Dr. Birx into the president and said, 15 days are not enough. We need to go 30 days.
And Terry Moran joins us now. Terry, we just saw that the president play a pre-produced video at the daily briefing with clips saying what a great job the Trump administration is doing. Before you talk us through what just happened, just give me a sense, in all your time covering the White House, have you ever seen anything like that?
Well, Lindsay, it does show how these briefings in a national emergency pandemic have shifted from primarily informational, how the administration is responding by policy, what people should do, to promotion. This is a campaign year, and it was a slickly produced campaign-style video. I've seen sort of the use of those screens for informational video. This is, make no bones about it, it looked like a campaign commercial and felt like a campaign commercial. From the podium of the White House, when the purpose of that briefing is at least nominally trying to inform people about the policies the administration is pursuing with this pandemic and what they should do about it.
And on the debate of reopening the country's economy, the president also weighed in on that today, saying that he has the authority to make that tough decision. While some governors, though, they're pushing back, saying that it's up to the state. So who's right here?
Mostly the governors, Lindsay. It is clear by constitutional law and federal statute that public health and safety are the province primarily of our states. We have that federalist system. Local cops police local streets. Local public health inspectors try to manage the public health of the states. The president does have power over interstate. He can quarantine a state. But what happens inside, the opening of schools and businesses, that is the province of governors, unless the president wants to cut funding, federal funding to states that don't abide by his timetable. That it might even be constitutionally iffy, but that is the one tool that he has at his disposal. He, of course, does have the bully pulpit. He can cheerlead states to reopen, and they might do so because of his leadership, but his toolbox is limited when it comes to the Constitution.
Terry Moran, always grateful for your insight. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Lindsay.
And turning overseas, across the globe, we have seen nations approach this crisis in varying ways. While most have decided to lock down and shut down large sectors of the economy, some are taking a bit of a different tack. So tonight we wanted to take a look at two of those nations, Sweden, which you could say is lockdown light, and Germany, which has invested heavily in testing. Both nations are relying heavily on their citizens to act responsibly. So how are they doing? As Ian Pannell reports, the results might surprise you.
London, Paris, Madrid, Rome. COVID-19 has brought much of Western Europe to its knees, claiming the lives of tens of thousands of people, shuttering entire economies, even infecting some of its leaders.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been moved to the intensive care unit after his condition worsened.
Normal life as we know it has stopped, but not everywhere. Remember this? Going out, eating, drinking, socializing? Well, in Sweden, they're still doing it, albeit at a safe distance. Unlike all of its European neighbours, Swedish policy is lockdown light. Citizens can still mostly go about their lives, the government entrusting its people to just use common sense.
The difference in shopping right now is that I have to remind myself to keep distance, which I'm not really good at, but I'm trying.
To communities across America battling this invisible enemy, these scenes may seem unbelievable, dangerous even. But the Swedes have a very different approach. From the outset, the authorities trusted the people to do the right thing and have tried to keep life as normal as possible in abnormal times.
The tradition in Sweden when it comes to healthcare and public health has very much to work with voluntary measures, to have a dialogue with our population, to give good advice and tell people what we're trying to achieve, not telling them exactly what you should do in every situation.
Frederick and Annika have two young children. They both support the government's policy.
I think that it's impossible to keep people locked down for a long period of time, and everything points to the fact that this is not going to be over in a couple of weeks.
But it doesn't mean there are no impacts. In Stockholm, it means Annika's 7th and 8th grade students come to school once or twice a week.
The students really miss school. They love to be in school when they are. It's kind of hard for them to cope with distance learning since they haven't been doing that before, really. Då ska vi titta lite grann på realismen idag.
But her children's preschool is still open daily. and gatherings are still permitted with caution.
We're not really hanging out, we're not having dinners. We actually went to an outdoor birthday party last weekend, and that was with the kids that our kids normally see at preschool.
The Swedes are still partaking in simple activities the rest of us may have taken for granted before the virus consumed and changed us, and they're doing so in part because of trust.
I do have a lot of faith in my government. I thought in the beginning that it was like kind of lame behavior, but I think that it seems to work, so I think it's good that we can live as we used to.
Infections are inevitable, so the Swedes set guidelines like banning gatherings of more than 50 people to try to keep the public safe without upending their lives or their economy, hoping that when they emerge from this, their economy is in much better shape than those who've embraced a total lockdown.
I think we're all using high-risk approaches these days. Closing down society is definitely a high-risk approach. We believe that the slow spread of the virus, while the healthcare keeps on working, while society is still in a fairly normal situation, is the best way to run this.
But the Swedes may have made a catastrophically bad move. The latest numbers show that Sweden's death rate is double that of its Nordic neighbours who embraced a full lockdown. And despite the effort, a recession may be unavoidable according to the IMF, as the death mounts across Europe and the critics of the laid-back policies are now asking for tougher measures. Germany's also been an outlier, but for very different reasons.
Our country has not seen such measures before, and they will, of course, be severe, but they are currently necessary to reduce the number of contacts and thereby the number of infections and severe cases in order to make sure our health system is able to cope.
Methodical and organised, they've been extensively testing, tracking and isolating cases.
We have some basic conditions that make Germany maybe more resilient to such a situation. And I would think that one of those is the big testing capacity. Another one is a very strong health system.
The testing, a stark contrast from the UK, which was slow to shut down. On the week of March 16th, as Italy reached its apex, the virus had already claimed thousands of lives there. Hundreds of thousands had already been infected. And days later, Prime Minister Johnson only just officially ordered a nationwide lockdown, a move Italy had taken weeks prior.
I don't understand why the government didn't decide in time to protect the citizens.
And now the UK's death rate has reached over 11,000. Even though Germany is more populated than the UK and had one of the first European clusters, their reported number of deaths is strikingly low, just above 3,000. While Germany's imposed restrictions on movements and gatherings, they've been less stringent than other European countries, and much like Sweden, many people understand it's just their civic duty to protect others.
I think each person decides for him or herself if he or she needs to go out and have a walk or get some sun. I think it's nice to have some sort of freedom. Still, it's important to be conscious and stay home for the sake of the health of many people.
Around the world, countries are grappling with the balance between lockdown, liberty, and preserving economic life. Everyone will be looking very closely at these European exceptions, desperate to learn lessons.
Yeah, lockdown versus liberty, really interesting. Ian Pannell joins us now live in London. And Ian, we saw those images of Sweden, many people going about their normal lives, but you also mentioned that their death rate is significantly higher than their neighbors. What do we know about their cases overall?
Yeah, that's right. And a significant number appear to be focused on the elderly, which again was a part of the population that Sweden set out to try and protect. Look, first of all, a word of caution. We are not necessarily comparing apples and apples when we're looking at different countries and trying to put together some kind of comparative statistical analysis. Different countries are counting the death rate differently. Different countries are testing differently. And of course, every single country is trying to get a grasp on how to deal with it, how to test as much as as possible and how to give honest as you can figures for the numbers of deaths and the number of infections. So Sweden certainly has a higher rate. It looks like their strategy was high risk, but it's also entirely possible that they're including certain people in their statistics for the number of dead that other countries aren't. But on the face of it, there have been an outlier in Europe, and there are severe questions as to whether or not their strategy has been successful. However, the important caveat is, when they emerge from this, like when Britain and Italy and Spain and France also emerged from this, perhaps their economy, their lifestyle is going to be much better protected, and as a society, they're ready to get on with things in a much better position.
And perhaps this is a bit of another apple-orange comparison, but when you talk about Germany, you mentioned their aggressive testing there, but isn't the EU supposed to be a bloc? I mean, how is it that their results are so different than, say, Italy or Spain?
Yes, EU is supposed to be a bloc, but it's always been the inbuilt weakness of the European Union, especially at times, sometimes of crisis, that countries tend to act in their own national interest. I mean, there have been attempts, for example, to try and coordinate on acquisition of PPE, acquisition of ventilators, but it's been a very controversial system, and no country can really afford to sit back and wait for group decisions to be made. But interestingly, in Italy, there's been something of a backlash about the failure, or what they see as the failure of the EU, to come to their aid when they needed it most. In other words, what we've seen a little bit in the United States, where you've shifted resources from state to state according to need, that hasn't really been the case in Europe. It has on a small scale, but not enough to justify the EU acting in concert. Had it done so, perhaps things would have been better. You just have to come to the conclusion no one really knew quite how to deal with this, and that's why we're in the mess we are right now.
And lastly, it's been another difficult day as far as deaths are concerned in the UK, where cases continue to surge. But elsewhere in Spain, we're already hearing rumblings about some being allowed to return to work. China, as we know, has also lifted restrictions, but they're worried about now a second wave. So can you walk us through what some of those nations are doing?
Yeah, and we're all desperate to know that there is some path, some way out of this light at the end of the tunnel. Just very quickly on the UK, I think what's really important to say, because we were talking about statistics earlier, the UK in its official stats has not been including deaths in nursing homes, or certainly not all of them, and it's about to do so. So its figures are going to go up. So again, those comparative numbers, not easy to justify, but you're right, there is an easing off. I think European countries are desperate to try and get back to business in some way that they can. China has tried this, as has Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan, and they've had mixed results, mainly because what they've seen are nationals coming back into the country, Chinese nationals returning home, students, and they have brought the virus with them. This particular outbreak in China was right up on the border with Russia. Was it possibly because of cross-border traffic? So there are anomalies, there are questions, but on the whole, it's starting to look better in Asia. Lindsay?
All right, Ian, really interesting to look at those different countries and how everyone is responding differently. Ian, panel, thank you so much for that. And shifting gears now, a deadly storm system has ripped through the East Coast, straining emergency services that are already stretched too thin. A series of tornadoes touched down in 8 states from Texas to North Carolina, leaving at least 26 people dead. The storms destroyed full neighborhoods with damage particularly bad in the town of Monroe, Louisiana. Some devastating scenes there of ravished communities. ABC's Victor Oquendo is on the ground in Louisiana with a closer look.
Tonight, relentless storms slamming the Northeast in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. A family inside their home outside New York City when this tree fell.
And it just came crashing to the ceiling. I mean, I was lucky to get out alive.
One of many families with damaged homes amid those shelter-in-place orders. Outdoor coronavirus testing facilities shut down across the region.
The high winds and driving rain made the conditions unsafe for both visitors and health workers to open today.
At that massive field hospital treating COVID patients in New York Central Park, officials confident the tents can withstand the wind.
Oh, you can see it. It's ripping stuff up right here. Debris.
More than 50 tornadoes reported in the last 24 hours, including this one northeast of Jackson, Mississippi. In Lawrence County, Mississippi, the Sheriff's Department mourning the loss of Deputy Robert Ainsworth and his wife Paula, writing, "Robert left this world a hero as he shielded Mrs. Paula during the tornado." Chattanooga, Tennessee, taking a direct hit from an EF3 twister with winds of 145 miles per hour. The decision of whether to open shelters amid the COVID-19 pandemic faced across the region.
At the end of the day, life safety had to persist over everything else.
And in Monroe, Louisiana, where hundreds of homes were damaged,
a picture of me and my mother. My mother died a couple of years ago.
Felicia Thomas and her daughter Cynthia now picking up the pieces. They were trapped inside their decimated home with 3 young children until their neighbor, Jared Moore, came racing to the rescue.
What was your first instinct?
We gotta help them. We gotta get them out. If we don't get them out there, they're not gonna make it.
Everyone made it out safely, grateful to be alive.
And Victor Oquendo joins us now live with more. Victor, how was the response to this disaster impacted by emergency services that are already dealing with the coronavirus pandemic?
Lindsay, we asked that same question to Mississippi's Emergency Management Executive Director. He told us that these storms could not have come at a worse possible time. Resources are already stretched thin, and this would greatly impact their response. Here in Louisiana, they're doing what they can to start the cleanup process. They're trying to get power back up and running and putting some tarps over some roofs that can still be salvaged. For people who are displaced, the Department of Homeland Security is actually moving families into local hotels instead of shelters. That should help with social distancing. Lindsay?
Yeah, talk about adding insult to injury. Victor Oquendo, thank you so much for that. When we come back, the investigation now underway. The video from security cameras showing a doctor on the front lines of the coronavirus fight handcuffed in front of his home. Infections and even riots are breaking out in some prisons, the crisis behind bars. And we're seeing long lines at food banks at the same time. We're hearing about farmers being forced to dump some of their excess food. What's the disconnect? We'll speak to a farmer and a lawmaker. But first, here are some of the trending stories on abcnews.com.
That is very dangerous.
ABC News, straightforward.
I work in Utah, and Wyoming mainly, and but through this program that I'm doing, I was supposed to be abroad for the larger part of March and April, and that got canceled. And so now I found myself with a lot of time on my hands, and just at the same time, kind of early March, the numbers coming out of New York started getting very, very scary. One of my very good friends and colleagues here at Maimonides got sick and got put in the ICU. And at that point, you know, you get just that kind of feeling it a little bit more personally, what is going on, made me certain decide that I probably should go and see if I could help out. knowing that you could go and help, I think just like I felt as if I had to do something. And then I still have my Mondays email, and I get the emails that go out to the group, and seeing that, you know, there were people who were sick and shifts that needed to be covered, and knowing that everyone's stretched fairly thin, and that people back here, you know, friends and colleagues with young children and pregnant women were still going to work and exposing themselves, made me feel as if they can, then I certainly should as well. And if not me, then, you know, then who else?
One doctor's sacrifice. And in Miami, an African-American doctor who's been treating coronavirus victims was detained and handcuffed in front of his own house while loading his van with supplies that he says were intended to help the homeless. In video obtained by ABC News, Dr. Armin Henderson is shown wearing a mask and loading supplies into a van when a sergeant pulls up and begins questioning him. After a brief chat, he then walks away from the sergeant, which is when he says things started to escalate. Henderson told ABC News his biggest concern was that the sergeant was not wearing a protective mask and got in his face while yelling at him. Henderson wants to be tested now for COVID-19, and he alleges that he was detained simply because he's black. The chief of police in Miami says the incident is under investigation. While most of us are practicing social distancing to try to keep healthy, staying apart can be nearly impossible for more than 2 million inmates in prisons and jails across the country. Over 2,600 inmates and almost 3,000 staff members of prisons and jails nationwide have now contracted COVID-19, according to researchers at UCLA. Many say those numbers will only continue to grow. ABC's Alex Perez has a look at the coronavirus from behind bars.
While the outside world urges residents to stay home and practice social distancing, the inside world of overpopulated prison systems across the country struggling to stem the spread of COVID-19 among inmates and staff. At Chicago's Cook County Jail, more than 300 inmates have been diagnosed with COVID-19. At least 3 have already died. Inmates posting this sign on a cell: "Help, we matter too."
This is a dormitory.
Using contraband cell phones, inmates pleading for help in Alabama.
Help for the overcrowding, help for sanitary purposes.
At a Kansas prison, inmates smashed offices and set fires, taking over an entire cell block for hours, until staff used tear gas. The state now investigating.
We at LCM, this is what happens.
And in Louisiana, the ACLU has filed a lawsuit for the release of hundreds of vulnerable prisoners after at least 6 died there. Nationwide, the numbers staggering. Marianne Lemke worries about her fiance, Daniel Rodriguez. He's served 6 years of his 8-year sentence in Connecticut.
He has parole coming up no matter what, and I've reached out to the governor, I've reached out to the commissioner of corrections.
Her biggest fear? That he could be infected.
I believe there's 4 levels. He's on the 3rd level, 1 being the lowest. So heart conditions that he has already gives him palpitations.
In legal filings, state officials responded that Rodriguez is not, quote, medically eligible for release. The outbreak behind bars further complicated by unsanitary conditions, restricted access to soap and water, and the fact that social distancing in jails is many times impossible.
See, the aisle is too small. It is way, way too small.
Our thanks to Alex Perez for that report. And we still have a lot more to report on here on ABC News Prime. While so many businesses have closed, Amazon keeps hiring. But what are they doing to protect their workforce? Plus, the big endorsement, the reason, besides them both being in the same party, that Bernie Sanders says he will back Joe Biden for president. But first, our post of the day, a mother still struggling with an unimaginable loss.
To be able to have this moment with my family and have the finish that we had. And amazing how fast time goes, man.
With millions of Americans stuck at home, sales at Amazon are booming, and so is that company's hiring. So let's take a look by the numbers. Today, Amazon announced it will hire an additional 75,000 workers to meet demand as Americans turn even more to online shopping during this pandemic, which has led to slower delivery times for many Amazon products. The online retail giant had already filled an additional 100,000 full and part-time warehouse and delivery jobs in just the last 4 weeks. And after spending more than $350 million to increase pay for Amazon workers, today the company said it expects that to increase to more than $500 million. Despite some pay and benefit increases, Amazon workers from at least 3 facilities have staged protests calling for more safety measures for workers amid the COVID-19 outbreak. Amazon says it has worked to improve safety in recent weeks, including employee temperature checks, as well as widespread use of masks. And just today, Amazon officials said they will work to start regular COVID-19 testing for some frontline workers. And still a lot to get into here on ABC News Prime. San Francisco police busted a party with more than 150 people packed inside a nightclub. Yes, in the middle of this pandemic. The captain stood up for them, and he was removed from his post. Tonight, an update on one of the sailors sickened by the coronavirus on that aircraft carrier. But first, our myth bust of the day. Does lemon juice mixed with baking soda help to prevent catching COVID-19?
The death toll from a slate of wicked weather has climbed to at least 24 people, with fatalities now reported in Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, and Arkansas.
It just tore everything just ripped off, and
this house lifted entirely off its foundation, thrown into the middle of the street. 4 states declaring states of emergency. These storms now moving through the Northeast, forcing some COVID-19 testing facilities in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York to close because the weather is too severe.
Today, New York's governor striking a hopeful note as key COVID-19 figures continue to indicate New York is flattening the curve.
I believe the worst is over if we continue to be smart.
Cuomo adding the challenge now lies in how the state will move to reopen. Around the nation, the pandemic is taking hold in new hotspots. The number of confirmed cases soaring by 21% in Massachusetts, while Pennsylvania expects a surge this week after more than 2,800 new cases were reported Saturday.
Coming into work, you're driving in thinking, I don't know what I'm going to see. I don't know how I'm going to treat these patients. Am I going to have the space to put them?
And the Navy now revealing a sailor who tested positive for the virus on the USS Theodore Roosevelt has died.
Spain reports a 2.09% rate of increase in new COVID-19 cases and begins to reopen for some businesses that can't operate remotely. Monday, police were distributing 10 million masks in public transit points. In France, ICU cases are declining, but the country has just extended its lockdown through May 11th. Sweden continues what they are calling a low-scale approach, prohibiting gatherings of more than 50 people, allowing restaurants and retail to remain open during the pandemic. But in Russia, the pandemic is becoming more severe with a spike in diagnosed cases over the weekend. And in China, a rise in cases for the first time in 6 weeks, and most seem to be coming from outside travelers.
Your endorsement means a great deal. It means a great deal to me.
Joe Biden holding an online coronavirus briefing today with former rival Bernie Sanders, and Sanders joining forces with Biden to unite the party.
So today I am asking all Americans, I'm asking every Democrat, I'm asking every independent, I'm asking a lot of Republicans to come together in this campaign to support your candidacy, which I endorse.
Welcome back. Tonight, San Francisco police have shut down an illegal underground nightclub, which they are calling the epitome of irresponsibility. Take a look at the surveillance video released by authorities today. Footage shows around 150 people entering and exiting the location. San Francisco's district attorney today compared it to dropping a lit match in the woods during fire season, saying, quote, "Who knows how far the damage will spread." Investigators seized fog machines, DJ equipment, gambling machines, and hundreds of dollars of cash from inside. And putting food on the table is certainly a growing concern for Americans who have lost their jobs or lost wages because of the coronavirus economic shutdown. Those difficult images of cars lined up for miles at food banks in cities across the nation tell the story. Some food banks say that they've actually struggled, and they continue to struggle, to keep up with the demand. But those images are hard to reconcile with the ones that we're also seeing from dairy farmers being forced to dump excess milk because restaurants and schools that would usually buy it are shut down. Now some produce farmers are burying their harvested crops that also would have been ordered by schools and restaurants. So one of the farmers struggling with this shutdown joins us now. Shaw Myers is the CEO of Owyhee Produce on the Oregon-Idaho border. He's had to dispose of the surplus onions that he grows on his farm. Shay, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
When did your farm first start to feel the impact of restaurants and schools, which are usually some of your biggest customers, shutting down?
You know, a big part of our customer base is in the New York area. So as soon as New York started having its challenges, we started feeling the impact here. But the initial results were not reductions in shipments, rather it was increases because everyone was going out to buy more at the grocery store.
And you have to dispose of 4 million pounds of onions. And where does it all go? And does some farmers struggle to even find somewhere to put those leftover products?
Yeah, there's always some surplus, but not to the level that we're talking about now. And so what we've done is we're going into composting pits and back onto fields as fertilizer. But it's very expensive fertilizer, as you might imagine.
I would imagine that. But at the same time, we see these nearly endless lines at food banks. So why not just make a deal with them somehow to get your products to them instead of throwing them away?
Certainly. So it's a matter of timing. There's a couple of reasons for that. But the first one is we're just barely starting to feel the demand, the need for that at the food banks. Up to now, we have seen such a reduction in demand from food service and retail that we haven't had anywhere to go with the product. So those deals can be made, but there's one other piece to that puzzle, and that's the fact that we're already losing, right? We've already grown this crop. It's not packaged yet, and there's a cost in packaging it. So when you get nothing, you're actually, not only are you donating the profit or the product at zero, you're actually incurring another $3 per unit loss if you make that donation without any support.
Well, dairy farmers, for example, they've asked for the USDA to buy their extra milk. Have produce farmers asked for anything similar? What could the government do at this point right now that you would say that is helpful?
Yeah, so the support that we really could have is buying domestically. We have enough onions in the United States to serve the entire country easily. But what we're struggling with right now is with the currency differentiation between the United States and Mexico. That strong dollar is meaning that Mexico wants to push more of their product to the United States. And so that is probably the quickest, easiest thing to do from an economic standpoint is to at least temporarily prevent some of the product from crossing over from Mexico.
Shay Myers, we so appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, she joins us now. Senator, thanks so much for talking with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Last week, we heard from a dairy farmer in your home state who's facing what so many farmers are dealing with now, an excess supply. Take a listen.
Our milk is made into cheese, as is most of the milk in Wisconsin made into cheese. And a lot of that cheese is destined for food service industry consumption. Schools, pizzerias, restaurants, conferences, etc. Since the stay-at-home orders have been issued, those markets have dried up completely. We've been asked to dispose of 20% of our milk going forward for the next 6 weeks, and we will not be getting paid for that milk as it stands right now.
You've called on the USDA to buy some of that excess supply. So what are you hearing from them on taking that action, and what can Congress do to address this?
Well, first of all, I led a delegation letter on this issue to Secretary Perdue, and we were very concerned that a number of actions needed to be taken. Like the situation you were just talking about with onions, and as our Wisconsin farmer was talking about in terms of the drop-off of institutional and large-scale orders. In Wisconsin, a lot of the cheese is produced in sites where they're either producing for the retail grocery market or for larger industrial uses. And so it becomes a real challenge because one set of processors is having a heightened demand and another set of processors is having a much lower demand. But we asked as a delegation for Secretary Perdue to use the power he has from the CARES Act to purchase significant amounts of these commodities and milk and cheese, et cetera, but also to reopen a program called the Dairy Margin Protection Program, which is a sort of insurance product that farmers can buy to ward against times when the price of milk drops really low. I had a chance to talk with Secretary Perdue last week and urge him to take the many actions we called on him to take. And while he thought that there would be some significant USDA purchases for food banks and other sites, he did not show any indication of being willing to reopen the Dairy Margin Protection Program.
Well, these farmers say they can't pick up the additional cost of getting their products to food banks and other charitable groups. So what else can be done to make sure that the food doesn't go to waste and instead makes it into the hands of Americans who desperately need it right now?
Well, one of the things, when you have warehouses filled with cheese, for example, that's destined for a large-scale purchaser like a restaurant or a school, et cetera, it's not packaged appropriately for a food bank. It might be a 50-pound wheel of cheese or 10 pounds of shredded cheese. And so we do have to figure out something to make it not go to waste and so that people can get the nutrients that they need. And so I talked with Sonny Perdue for a fair amount of time on how we do that, but we can't just throw up our hands and say no. And I have to say that dairy farmers in Wisconsin had a very, very rough time for the last several years before this pandemic is having its impact. Prices of milk were low. We had trade wars that resulted in retaliatory tariffs against cheese. Weather was not our friend. And so we've lost 2,000 dairy farms in Wisconsin in the last 3 years.
I want to turn to the economy for a moment. So many Americans, as you know, are out of work, and small businesses are certainly taking the biggest hit there. You're part of the Democratic leadership team in the Senate. Will Republicans and Democrats get to a deal on additional funds for small businesses before the new loan program is expected to run out of money? I mean, what's the state of talks right now?
Well, there are negotiations that are active, and I think that one of the key issues is that not all the small businesses that ought to be getting these funds are. And I'll give you a key example of how the program needs to be fixed as well as expanded with a lot of infusion of additional dollars. Farmers usually don't qualify for SBA loans, but under the CARES Act, they do. The problem is the formula is such that they can benefit very little from those loans because it's based on payroll, not other fixed costs and overhead. And so we've got to fix something like that so that it can be another avenue of help for our farmers. And there's many other flaws with it right now. It's a massive undertaking. We knew there would be some flaws, but let's fix them at the same time we put additional dollars in. And let's not forget that this is both an economic crisis and a public health crisis. We cannot forget about pressing on testing and personal protective equipment and aid to hospitals that are overwhelmed with the surge that they're seeing.
You just talked about those flaws and the need for these fixes. What do you think is the single biggest fix that should be made to the next stimulus package?
Well, the topic we're talking about was largely absent from this CARES Act, which was our third emergency response package. There was very little within the USDA to help with the situation, and we're leaving a lot of rural America and farmers behind. So that's one area, but there are so many things. I certainly want to see an OSHA standard that provides emergency temporary standards for people who are essential workers. Because whenever we begin to reopen sections of our economy, we've got to keep people safe. We've got to have the testing and the personal protection equipment and standards so that people aren't dying while working at or getting sick while working at a grocery store.
I also want to talk to you about the results of last week's controversial primary voting in Wisconsin, which we're seeing results come in for tonight. ABC News has now projected Joe Biden will win the Democratic primary there. But clearly, not everyone who wanted to vote was able to. You and your colleague, Senator Ron Johnson, have called for an investigation into why some Wisconsin residents did not receive absentee ballot votes in time. So are you worried about potential chaos in November if Wisconsin and other states have to vote largely by mail ballots or absentee?
Well, I hope that it is a lesson for the country and that we don't make the same mistakes that were made in the state of Wisconsin. We wanted a safe and fair election. We got neither because of the pandemic. No one should ever have to choose between their safety and health and their right to cast a vote. And that's what happened in the state of Wisconsin. Now, I asked Senator Johnson to join me in looking into what happened at the U.S. Post Office without getting timely delivery and some missing postmarks that will mean that other ballots aren't counted tonight. And that's because I want to find out what happened so we can rebuild trust in vote by mail, because I really think that's where we have to head. And we cannot afford to have this sort of chaos and risk to health and life that we saw in Wisconsin last Tuesday.
Senator Baldwin, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Massive forest fires are closing in tonight on Chernobyl, and locals say that the situation is now critical. Flames are within about a mile of a major radioactive waste storage site there. The head of the Tour Guide Association in Chernobyl is accusing the Ukrainian government of concealing the scale of the problem, much like the Soviets did during the nuclear disaster in 1986. The fires have caused local radiation levels to rise, but Ukraine's government has insisted the fires do not pose a threat beyond their immediate vicinity and that levels in Kyiv and its surroundings are normal. And still ahead, the mother-daughter embrace that had us all choked up, and the elderly embracing TikTok in quarantine. That and more in our Good News Roundup. But as we go to break, take a look at the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio, honoring the medical workers on the front lines. Oh, that gets me every time. This is the just heartwarming moment that a 6-year-old girl in Turkey is reunited with her mother, who's a healthcare worker who's been treating coronavirus patients for a month. You see there the tears of joy that little girl has now that mom is back at home. And finally tonight, we want to leave you with some additional moments that will warm your heart and make you smile. James Longman, take it away.
Hi everyone. As we continue to socially distance, the world outside, nature seems to be revitalized. Take a look at these extraordinary pictures out of India. Air pollution is plummeting, and so the Himalayan mountaintops are now visible for the first time in 30 years. As we all wait indoors, the earth is healing. This really sweet video out of China. Now, it was filmed on March 29th, but we just wanted to show you again, just because it really does encapsulate how we'll all feel when we finally get to come out of lockdown. These two little kids, best friends, toddlers, meeting again.
They are. I can't believe you're back.
Really, really sweet. And speaking of viral videos, we wanted to show you some of these older folk who have got in on the social media trend. Check out this 87-year-old. He's called Grandad Joe, and he's picked up millions of adoring fans on TikTok. He's only been on it.
Really want this like I want this. If you don't, you can go ahead and tell. And I'm back on mine. R.I.P.
And he's not the only golden oldie finding his voice on social media. Check out some of the others joining the trend.
We're gonna keep ourselves busy. And if you wanna dance, you could dance. And if you wanna dance, da-da-da-da-da. That's the way it goes. That's the way it goes. TikTok makes me feel young. I'm glad Kevin mentioned it.
And then there's American actor Leslie Jordan. The 64-year-old has got on Instagram talking to what he calls his fellow hunker-downers, saying what we are all thinking.
What are y'all doing? This is awful. It's still March. How many days in March?
So it has come to this. Arning. To pass the time and watching a murder program on television. Honey, she killed him, and then she fed him to the tigers.
And Matthew McConaughey has been teaching us some important tips on how to survive this coronavirus crisis.
I'm bounty hunter Bobby Bandito, but you can call me Bobby B. I say it's high time we catch this killer, because we got more living to do. Now remember, stay at home. But if you gotta go, strap it on like so.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And take a look at this recovered patient in Queens, New York. Came out of the hospital and was met with this. And the outpouring of love and support for healthcare workers on the front line continues. These are some of the latest moments that have caught our eye. And we leave you now with this extraordinary rendition of Amazing Grace by Italian singer Andrea Bocelli. He sang at a deserted Milan cathedral on Easter Sunday. It was a message of love, of healing, and of hope.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that
It really was stunning. Stay safe, everybody, and be good to each other.
How sweet the sound indeed. Our thanks to James for that. Before we go tonight, the image of the day. Not exactly a sold-out crowd. A collection of cardboard cutouts, mannequins, and drum-playing robots filled the stands in Taiwan instead of real-life fans of baseball there, now that that's gotten back underway. This after the Chinese Professional Baseball League restarted its season after a month-long suspension because of coronavirus. It wasn't all stand-ins, though. The league did allow cheerleaders to root for their teams from the sidelines. And that is our show for this hour. Be sure to stay tuned to ABC News Live for more context and analysis of the day's top stories. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us, and have a good night.